Coming up later tonight and tomorrow, Mary Tyler Moore will join us for a pair of programs leading up to what I'll call a landmark television event. There's a 90-minute special on CBS Monday night, February the 18th, marking the 20th anniversary of the Mary Tyler Moore Show.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's finished now.
It's finished. It's a terrific show. It was going to be an hour, and Jack Haley Jr. produced it and had the tough task of looking at 168 episodes and choosing which little sound and film bites to use on the show, and went to the network and said, I can't figure out how to cut 20 minutes out of this show. Can you? And they said no, so you better have another half hour. So it went from an hour to an hour and a half, and everyone is just pleased as can be.
If you had been in that edit room,
yeah,
and I'm sure they consulted you anyway for your personal favorites,
yeah,
what did you tell them? What half dozen or so did you say, no matter what, you've got to include these?
Well, they really did a great job. I mean, Jack Haley did. He was the guy who made the selections, and he didn't miss a thing. He really didn't. I'm sure there are others if I went back and reacquainted myself with them, but they just don't come to the forefront of my mind right away. I'm thrilled with every single choice he made, including the many takes from the episode called Chuckles Bites the Dust, which is everybody's favorite. That particular episode won me an Emmy that year, and a lot of other people. And the director, a woman named Joan Darling, who had taken over for Jay Sandridge, who directed about 80% of our shows, and he felt that the show was a little too controversial, so he didn't want to direct it. And Joan Darling came in and directed it and walked away with an Emmy.
Too much controversy about the death of a clown?
Well, yes. You don't see that, Bob. You don't understand it. No, but we were laughing at a funeral. There was a minister on stage, and there was a man in a coffin who happened to be dressed like a clown. And they just felt, yeah, that it might be something that the audience wouldn't accept, laughing at a funeral, even though we've all been close to that, if not actually gone through it. What I loved about that show was that Mary Richards, who was just so above everyone else, who kept laughing and making jokes about Chuckles' death, she kept criticizing them and saying, where is your taste, where are your manners, where your soul? A man has died, how could you laugh? And then we get to the memorial service, and Mary was the one who just couldn't stop with giggles and got a little bit out of control.
Another episode I really liked, and I haven't seen the show, so maybe these are in and maybe they're not. When Nancy Walker, who played Rhoda's mother, came over and you let her stay at your apartment, and then she said, well, I would have paid for the motel anyway, and she's like chasing you around the...
Yes, trying to put the money in my pocket, and I keep refusing it. Yeah, that was a masterful piece of choreography and timing. That's not in it, but we could do another one.
This will be the last one I'll mention as my personal favorites because, as I said, who knows what's in and what's out, and everybody's got their own list. The show was so popular. But there was an episode where each of the men in the newsroom fantasized about what it would be like if they married you or if you were their lover.
Yeah, that was a great one. And my favorite fantasy in that show was the one where, I think it was Ed Asner's dream, it was projected to our 90s, and we wore old age makeup. Dick Smith, who is the master of strange makeup, did molds for our faces, and maybe you even have a shot of that. I don't have a shot of that, but it was wonderful because we got to be these really old, ancient people who were still vaguely recognizable as Lou and Mary, and I loved that one.
We should never overstate the importance of television because, first of all, it's entertainment.
Yeah.
And that's why it was successful, because all of you were, in your own way, funny.
Yeah.
So we're not trying to be pretentious here, but to what extent can we say, through the rearview mirror, that that portrayal of a working woman was important at that stage in American life in the early 70s?
Well, it was, and it was important because it did represent what women were going through in the 70s. They were standing up and saying, I must be heard, and I must be given equal pay. And also, we said, without getting on a soapbox and without declaring it for the world to hear, but just for ourselves to say, it's all right to be at home alone on Saturday night without a date, and it's all right to be surrounded by what I think was coined at that time, the phrase extended family. As long as you had the people with whom you worked around you, and as long as they loved and supported you, and you could fight with them and make up with them, that was a pretty good life.
And on this special, Every one of them's back, right? They're all there. Ed Asner's there, and Betty White, they're all there.
Everybody except Ted Knight, who is no longer with us.
He was so brilliant.
Wasn't he? Wasn't he just? He really was an actor of such depth. I kept hoping that I would see him in some wonderful dramatic production, because he had it. He really did.
You know, I said I wasn't going to mention another favorite, but you have to when you mention Ted Knight.
We'll give you just one more, Bob.
When Walter Cronkite shows up.
Oh, yes. That was great. That really was wonderful. We were all so nervous, and the character of Mary Richards, of course, was nervous meeting him, too. And all she could say when introduced to him was, nice. Just nice. So nice. And that's the way we were all behaving on the set. Nobody ever said anything intelligent the whole 4 days he was with us.
Could you tell if he had been a fan of the show, or at least was familiar with it?
Oh, yes, because he wasn't making a second career out of guesting on other shows, you know. I don't think he did. He was recently on Murphy Brown's show, and I think that was only the second appearance he made in a situation comedy.
Yeah, you could pretty much tell. There were a lot of indicators, but one of them about how MTM had gotten into the public consciousness was that Johnny Carson showed up. And John doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
Walter Cronkite, Betty Ford, post-First Lady toward the end. She makes an appearance on the show. Yeah.
Oh, it says something, and it's kind of sad. It was true then, and I think it's true now, that that really special programming is so rare. But when there is something that's unusual, big people will break their own personal set of rules and go on television and make an appearance.
When did it strike you, and I stipulate this is an awkward thing to talk about because it's people's affection for you, but the show was more than successful. You had won almost 30 Emmys as a show, and you won 4 of them yourself. 5.
Well, wait a minute, no, not for that show. Not for that show. I mean, I won 3 for that show, and 2 for the Dick Van Dyke Show.
So actually what I was doing was averaging them and coming up with 4. But in any case, there's lots of hardware on the woman's shelf is what we're getting to. But there are other shows that have that sort of objective success. Not many, but a few. But I can't think of very many programs where it really got into people's hearts that way. And people used to talk about our Mary, and they really idealized you.
Yeah.
It must have been rewarding, but in another way, it must have also been awkward and uncomfortable.
No, it never. I never thought of myself as being a role model, and this Our Mary business really only started after the show went off the air. So that was all right, because then I didn't have to live up to it or you know, in any way try to match it personally. And I can't and didn't. I'm just not as funny in my own home as I am when I have all those writers around. And I think that's the essence of it, that we had brilliant writers who were willing to write. You know, today it seems to me that a lot of television writers do 1 year of a series that is lucky enough to be renewed, and they want to be the producers of that show. And they don't really want to write anymore. So nobody really puts the time in that they did in those days.
Does everybody fall right back into their old patterns when you all got together for the special?
It was like going to a reunion, a school reunion, which I did several years ago, and I found that 25 years later, the relationships were all the same. Yeah. We certainly had made changes in our lives, married, had children, divorced, became successful in various careers or didn't succeed, whatever. But the personalities, the essence of the personalities was the same, and the interaction was the same.
It must have been truly touching.
Yeah, it was. It's done in a very interesting way, too. We are sitting on a couch, which is supposedly my own home, and we're looking at television, watching the clips. And we were actually seeing the clips as they rolled them. And so the camera got our real, spontaneous reactions to what we were looking at. And at the end of the show, we show the last clip of the last show, where we had all huddled together in that mass hug and crabbed our way over to the box of Kleenex. And it was so curious, because when we got up to say goodbye, the camera was supposed to sort of pan back, and we would just be sort of hugging, and we went into that same hug without its being planned. We all just stood up.
And everyone was in the same spot in relation to each other?
Well, not necessarily the same spot, but we did that without instead of going, oh, God, it was great to see you, and oh, Cloris, we just all glommed into the one position. And I had an ache in my throat for about 3 days afterwards.
This episode, which you mentioned earlier, where everybody kind of does that little shuffle over.
Singing It's a Long, Long Way to Tipperary.
over for the Kleenex. That was really an event that was much anticipated. People talked about it for weeks before. How will they wrap it up? How will they resolve the relationships?
I'm not sure exactly how it worked, but I do know that Jim Brooks and Alan Burns and Ed Weinberger brought in just about every writer who had written more than 1 or 2 scripts, you know, people who had been contributing writers right along who had been part of the staff. So I think they ended up with maybe 10 or 12 writers, and I'm not sure how they broke it down, but maybe it was, well, you two write this scene and you two write that scene, and so on. But they all had their hands in it, and it was one of the best scripts we ever did. We felt, even if it were not the last episode, if we could step back from it, it was on its own a brilliant episode.
Did you feel a particular responsibility, not just to make it a good show relative to the other shows, but to resolve it in a way that people could live with?
Well, yeah, although it wasn't my responsibility, because I never really became that involved in the writing at all. I mean, to a very small extent did I ever have to just say, hey, wouldn't it be good if? They were so brilliant, they came up with all the concepts and executed them beautifully. But the concern that I had was that I would be able to get the dialogue out, because that script was somewhat similar to what was happening. We were all breaking up. The characters at WJM were going their separate ways. Everybody had been fired except the one person who was completely inept, Ted Knight, who was going to stay on. So our scenes with each other were scenes of goodbye and scenes of communicating great affection and love and concern, and so that made it just about the hardest little bit of acting I've ever done, and I know for everyone else too, to get the dialogue out, to not crack up and be unable to carry on.
Isn't it nice to be able to look back and say that whatever the reasons were that was the time to bring the curtain down, it proves to be just about right?
I'm not altogether sure.
Really?
You see, it was the writers, really, who felt that they were possibly going to face that problem, that they couldn't, maybe they couldn't keep up the great work that they had done. And so they were the ones who said, we'd like to think about calling it a day after 7 years. And I was not for it. I really wasn't. But then I didn't have to write the episodes. My job was a relatively easy one. But I think it certainly allowed them to go on to do other shows and become even better known and amass the riches and fortunes of success. But I don't think that they would have written any less the quality of show in the 8th or 9th year. And so for that reason, I think we probably could have
So you probably could have gone to, let's say, 10? Could have made it an even 10?
Maybe. Bill Paley, who was the president of the network and chairman of the board, and mighty fine and mighty important person, sent me a cartoon that was in the New Yorker. And he sent it with a note saying, I know how this fellow feels. And it was a man standing at the precipice of an enormous chasm, and he has a television set held over his head. And underneath it, it says, the day after the Mary Tyler Moore Show went off the air.
How much trouble did you have pushing little ideas that might have moved toward the edge through the censors? You mentioned earlier that even the idea of laughing at a funeral, even in the context of a comedy show, there was opposition to that. Were there other situations?
Well, in the very beginning, when Jim Brooks and Alan Burns wrote their proposal for the basis of the series and presented it to CBS, they had me playing a woman who was recently divorced from her husband, and they said, oh, no, there's nothing funny about divorce, and we just don't want to deal with that. And they said, well, a lot of women are divorced today. And I said, yes, but, you know, we just... And anyway, they'd think she was divorced from Dick Van Dyke. So let's not do that.
Ooh, Divorce I could handle,
yeah,
but that divorce,
not from
no.
Dick Van Dyke, right. Well, and I can understand that. He's a hell of a guy. But that was one of the things. I don't remember so many restrictions on our show as I do going back to the Van Dyke Show day.
Yeah. The implication was, though, even though as it was written she wasn't divorced, the implication was that she wasn't a virgin.
That's right.
And that was kind of new for a non-married.
Well, interestingly enough, too, when CBS said, no, you can't have her divorced because that's somehow immoral or amoral, it was all right for me to have implied that I was living with a doctor for 4 years who then dumped me, you see. And I never understood the difference, why that was all right and the divorce one wasn't. But, yeah, we kind of made it clear in one episode, I think it was about the second or maybe the third year, in which my mother makes a reference or my father makes a reference to a pill, and they're referring to an aspirin, and I say, oh, the birth control pill. Yeah. And then it comes out that, that in fact, Mary has had an active sex life.
Mary had a heck of an apartment, too.
Which one? The first one?
The first one, yeah.
That was great. That was wonderful, but it had an apartment for Phyllis, who by the third year had gone off to do her own series and was no longer available to play Phyllis Lindstrom. And it had Rhoda upstairs, who also had gone off to do her own series. So they decided to move me out of that house and put me in an apartment where we could have a lot of drop-in comedy, as they called it, neighbors who would ring the door and present the problem of the week. And it still was a funny show, and it was great, but everybody missed that set, and I did too.
You can see the Mary Tyler Moore special this coming Monday, the 18th at 9:30 Eastern Time on CBS, a 90-minute retrospective marking the 20th anniversary of the first episode of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. But if you can't wait to see her until then, be right back here tomorrow night at 1:30 Eastern Time, part 2 of Mary on Later. Until then, we'll see you.